Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just a couple of notes here on the continuing Middle East situation. A sensible commentary, to some degree, on the events in Egypt comes from a professor named Rabab el-Mahdi, a woman professor at the American University of Cairo. Rabab el-Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. And her commentary was that what has happened in Egypt is not a revolution, There has been no structural change. Well taken. We've often said here, revolution means a big institution is either created or gotten rid of. Slavery, monarchy, coming or going, foreign protectorate, foreign colonial status, important. A land reform, which tends to wipe out a whole parasitical class of latifundists and so forth. There has been no structural change in Tunisia, no structural change in Egypt. And the other thing she points out is a revolution means the revolutionaries take over the government. How can you call it a revolution if you have a bunch of golden youth running around in the square with reinforcements from the Muslim Brotherhood from time to time when needed to give some oomph in terms of the numbers? But then when the revolution occurs, the army takes over the government, and you're not the army. Any revolutionary knows the goal of a revolution is the revolutionaries take over the government. This has not happened. This is just an amazing thing that they don't seem to have thought of this. The goal of a revolution is not to force a military takeover of a civilian government, however oppressive, but for the revolutionaries to take over the government. And nowhere has this happened. You don't see Ghonim of Google becoming the military dictator of Egypt, right? It's not him. It's Field Marshal Tantawi. So as this professor points out, this was only a beginning, and it points to the limitations, which is a class-based movement. It's essentially the privileged upper middle class, the golden youth, as I've called them. So it's a coup d'etat by the army in response to some street demonstrations and some riots and a whole lot of noise coming from the United States. So that's some interesting commentary from Professor Rabab el-Mahdi. And this was on the Empire program run by a guy called Marwan Bishara, who is the British voice there, purveying a British intelligence line there at Al Jazeera. So now let's switch gears and look at the austerity psychosis here in Washington, D.C. Now, this is continuing, and we need to counter it. We must remember that budget cuts in a depression, in the entire historical experience of the 20th century and 21st century, you cut the budget in a depression, you will raise the deficit. That is not the way to do it. It does not work. You'll be confronting a worse situation in your next fiscal year or whatever it is. We've also had now, coming into this austerity psychosis, or Abbauwahn, as it was known in the Weimar Republic, the insane obsession with cutting, deconstructing the attained level of civilization and government in the name of this will-o'-the-wisp of a balanced budget. Back in the Weimar Republic, it was Hjalmar Schacht, later Hitler's finance minister, who came forward accusing the government of faking it and not bringing the budget into material balance. This past week, Standard & Poor's attack the United States Treasury. Standard & Poor's comes out and says the outlook on U.S. debt is negative because the parties can't agree. Standard & Poor's, you should be in jail. You should have been indicted and tried, and you should be in the penitentiary now based on what you did during 2007-2008 when they were issuing AAA highest ratings to absolute junk being issued by Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, zombie bankers, hedge fund hyenas up and down Wall Street. This is, in effect, it meets the qualifications of the RICO statute for the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization. It has all of the earmarks of a criminal enterprise. But now they feel strong enough to come out and attack the United States government. This points to the fundamental choice of the modern era. We see the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and so forth, attacking the nation state. And now we've got a new front, or it simply calls attention to the existing economic, financial budget front. This is an attack on the nation state by the same neo-feudalist forces who run the CIA and the intelligence community. It essentially says the nation state is bankrupt. This is going to be the big thing now in Europe and the United States, where they don't want to have people attacking the government, but through demonstrations, right? That you have an oppressive regime, because you do. But now they say, these are bankrupt entities. Similarly, Fitch and Moody's have attacked China. They say the Chinese banks are not reliable because they're going to have problems with bad debts and problems with inflation. Remember that Standard & Poor's, Fitch and Moody's are to some extent para-governmental organizations. In other words, in many government entities or entities that are chartered by government, they have provisions in their bylaws that the only thing, for example, certain pension funds are allowed to invest in are securities that receive a AAA rating or a AA rating from, for example, Standard & Poor's. This should have been rolled back. The quasi-official, quasi-governmental status of Standard & Poor's has to be rescinded. It's a little bit like the idea that you can have Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac be privatized but keep a Treasury guarantee. No. Either they've got to be nationalized, in which case they have a Treasury guarantee, or if they're privatized, then there's no Treasury guarantee. In this case, Standard & Poor's uses an implied association with the U.S. and state governments to attack the U.S. and the state governments. Now, the financial crisis rolls along. Gold over 1,500, indicating crisis of confidence in the dollar. The dollar falling. Oil this morning at 108, 109. Inflation growing across the board. And then what we're seeing, the oligarchy, the finance oligarchs themselves, dumping the U.S. dollar. This is now the Washington Post of this morning, Friday, April 22nd. The dollar no longer almighty. Warren Buffett, the great parasite finance oligarch, the sage of Omaha, who also should have had his appointment with the federal prosecutors, he now regards South Korea, the ROK, as a hunting ground for investments. It's a buying opportunity, and it's clear that this is Buffett betting against the U.S. dollar. He says, I would recommend against buying long-term fixed dollar investment, says Buffett. If you ask me if the U.S. dollar, this is a speech in New Delhi, if you ask me if the U.S. dollar is going to hold its purchasing power fully at the level of current times, it won't. So, long story short, Warren Buffett turns against the dollar. A typical neo-feudal parasite is now dumping the dollar as a currency. He, of course, joins Bill Gross of PIMCO, who is directly shorting U.S. Treasury bonds. He's yelping about the United States is one of the serial abusers of deficit and inappropriate budgets and finances. Dear Bill Gross, what do you contribute to this? You buy and sell bonds and derivatives, Bill, and you don't pay a penny of taxation on this. Let's solve it with the Wall Street sales tax, where you, Bill Gross, will pay 1% on your gross. Tax grosses gross. 1% on his transactions goes into the Treasury. Things will begin to look much better. We'll be back in a minute.